Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another episode of the MAM podcast. I know it's been long, but don't worry. This time I won't disappoint you because of the wait, because we have a very prestigious, prestigious person who I follow very dearly, like during my own prep also. And he's also a teacher. He's a pediatric intensivist in the US, and he's kind of my mentor because I ask him a lot of stupid questions I have during my, USMLE prep or something I need to ask. So without much further ado, let me welcome Dr. Rahul, who's a pediatric intensivist in the US.
Awesome, Subhav. Nice to talk to you. I'm so glad we can make this happen.
Yeah, finally. I know.
Thanks for the kind words.
Thank you for taking out time from your busy schedule. I know, but I think this podcast will be really, really helpful for me and for the audience because I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, some silly, some not so silly, some important, some fun. So I think we will gain a lot of value out of this.
Absolutely. I can't wait.
Okay, so let's begin. So without first, let's just start with like a brief introduction about yourself. If some of the people from my audience don't know about you, I'm sure you must have seen some video thumbnail pop up here and there about High Yield Guru, NBME topics, something if you are even remotely interested in USMLE. So yeah, Dr. Rahul, the stage is yours. Just like a brief introduction would be great.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Rahul. I currently am a pediatric intensivist, but just to go a little bit into my story, I was born and brought up in the US, and I had a unique path to medicine. I actually did a 6-year combined accelerated BSMD program where I did 2 years of undergrad rather than the traditional four, and then went directly into medical school. After that, I matched into categorical pediatrics in Cleveland, Ohio. And then subsequently, I completed my 3-year fellowship in pediatric critical care. And that was down in Atlanta, Georgia, at a university called Emory University. And then I finished now my first year of pediatric critical care as an attending. So definitely a big learning curve. But throughout this whole journey, one thing that I really ended up developing a passion for is medical education, and particularly high stakes examination. Now, high stakes examination is like a broad term that covers many different things, such as USMLE Step 1, Step 2, Shelf, NBMEs, Comp, CBSE, etc. So, all of those exams are under the research category of high stakes examination. And this is something that I've really contributed my overall academic career and personal career to helping students just like you prepare for and excel on this exam.
And I can just tell you it has worked.
Oh gosh.
So, so since you have so much of experience, not only clinically, but also, teaching and guiding students. So let us just begin with the very simple question of USMLEs. So I'm going to ask you a lot of simple questions about USMLEs. And let's start with step one. So imagine a person preparing for USMLE Step 1, maybe in med school, maybe out of med school, an international medical graduate. What would you say, like, how should they begin? They don't know anything. They just know this is Step 1. I need to pass this exam. And what should I do next? So what
Yeah.
should we do?
Well, I think that is such a great question. And I'm going to probably offer some general advice because I think many of these situations are so individualistic. In general, what I would say is begin with the end in mind. So, say you're an international medical graduate or a US medical graduate. If you want to appear for Step 1, the number one thing you can do is you can create great foundations during your medical school years. And
Yeah.
specifically, the practical way to do that is to really leverage third party resources and question banks throughout your overall coursework. So, number one, you can become familiar as to what's high yield for the USMLE. But number two, you can consistently start to apply those critical thinking questions very early on, such that then once you get to a phase where you want to prepare for step one in a more dedicated fashion, you have great foundations. But I think apart from that, if you want to get started, a few general things that I would recommend. Number one, leveraging question banks. I'm sure we'll go through specifics of that, but many of you are familiar with UWorld. But number two, I would also try to leverage some content review resources that are in the form of videos. Now, there are so many content review resources, books, etc. But I would really recommend you to focus 70% of your preparation on questions and 30% on content. But that split may differ based on where you are from a foundational standpoint. But again, it's a case by case basis, but hopefully that gives you a general overview.
Okay, so this was a general overview, content review questions. Now let's dive a bit deeper into this, into a little bit intricacies of this preparation. So you said content review and questions. How should one do it? Like I'm seeing like two general approaches that can be like, okay, I finish the content review, then I do the questions, or I finish some content review, I do questions of that some content review, and then like so on and so forth, I finish the whole course. So what would you suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, to be extremely practical, this is what I would recommend. I would first start dabbling after you have gone through the coursework in your medical school, for example. I would start dabbling into mixed time test mode questions. And the reason why I would do that is just to get a feel of how the overall block, what you're doing in terms of timing, but then also your accuracy when you have questions in different domains, rheum, psych, neuro, etc. Now,
Yeah.
in my opinion, if you initially are scoring less than 50%, then I would recommend you to take some of these question banks and do them more in a focus mode by organ system more than anything. I think that because there is, so much content, and the plethora of content is there, but the pace at which you need to know it is also a big challenge. The strategy of reviewing content and then doing questions may not be as sustainable. And so let's say you're less than 50% and you are going to go into organ system mode. My goal would be to actually layer your content review resources, and you finish something like cardio for 4 days, but in parallel, you're doing only cardio questions. It's going to be hard to match it up one-to-one, but say that you start getting into the groove where you're doing a set of videos, like let's say Pathoma for those 4 days, you're doing your sketchy or whatever farm resource or boards and beyond, and you have all of those videos allocated. And then you have dedicated time to do timed focus mode cardiology questions. I would say that that's a base layer strategy, with the next advanced layer being really focused on taking another question bank like AMBOSS or RX and actually doing focus questions in cardio anatomy, cardio physiology, etc., to kind of fill in the gaps with your weaknesses.
Got it. So actually, I ended up doing this. Like I did not plan because when I was preparing for step one, I obviously did not know how to. There was a lot of up and downs, trying this strategy, that strategy. I ended up doing what you just explained without actually, someone guiding me to do the same. For example, I first tried with, okay, just let me go through some videos, some BNB, some first aid. Then I was like, but when I see a question, I cannot even answer it. Like I know it, but I cannot crack the question. So I was like, now I should, I think, do questions to review it. Then I moved to the next system and I've forgotten the previous one. So I started Anki. Now with Anki, it's slow process because you have to do your reviews again and again. So I actually ended up doing two question banks, like one for focused review, I use RX, and then UWorld for the whole like random timed kind of thing I did because I had done the focus parts from RX. And I think that worked out pretty well for me. I passed it in the first attempt. There was no score. Uh, So yeah, so talking about resources, I mean, this general plan works, which I also ended up doing. But talking about resources, there are so many resources for step one. Like even I ended up covering a lot of resources, and that might not always be the good thing to do. So what are the resources or like the gold standard resources you would recommend that these are unmissable? Like maybe you were, but for video resources also, like perfect, never miss these resources, something like that.
Yeah, there are so many resources. And again, the best resource is the one that number one, you can stay consistent with. And the best resource is the one that you have defined as high value. And what I mean by that is basically value is quality over cost. And you can define cost as financial or time. But if you are getting in the numerator a high quality learning at an
Mm.
optimal time or at an optimal cost, then that resource is high value to you. Now, there are going to be resources which you definitely should lean in with. And number one, I think, is UWorld. Number two are the NBMEs. Those are kind of the gold standard, as we all know. But
Yeah.
then there are other supplementary resources that I think can optimize your preparation. Number one, Pathoma, I think, does an excellent job giving you the core foundations of pathology. Number two, things such as first aid, if used correctly, can
Mm.
also aid in your preparation. And throughout all of this, I created my own resource, which is High Guru, which I have tried to make a conscious attempt to do questions and content review kind of at the same time and merge them together. But I
Yeah.
think in general, it is not the content that is challenging. It is the application of the content. And that's
Yeah.
something that I feel very passionate about and something that I want to really emphasize as a key point when it comes to preparing for this exam.
Okay. So Pathoma, you were, and maybe to tie everything all up, you have created this resource for us, High Yield Guru, which I actually did the YouTube one, the NBME reviews, not the course. But I think now you have a whole course for step one, which ties everything together, and we can relate from the content and apply to the questions, something like that. And if I'm not wrong, you also have a book now
Yep.
for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have it somewhere around?
Oh,
Maybe you
actually,
could.
yeah, I have it on my shelf right here. Yeah. So, and this book kind of follows along with the videos,
We did.
but
Okay.
yeah, I just something that I found was a better way than just slides. Trying to put everything in one area.
Okay. So this book goes along with the course?
Yep, it goes along with the course. Yeah, so you can order it on Amazon, or you have a PDF if you wanted to do
Yeah.
it on your iPad, and then
Yeah.
you can annotate and go through it on the with the course videos.
So is this course for someone who is just starting out, or is this for someone who has some base and just want to tie everything together?
I think it might be more for the latter. In my
Yeah.
opinion, though, starting the course with your overall coursework in medical school is just going to allow for you to solidify a lot of the content. What
Yeah.
I've found is by the time students find this resource or just think about
Yeah.
operationalizing the resource, it's in dedicated study. And I find that rather than going through a whole litany of longer videos that are not application based, my videos, when you are in a dedicated study period, when you're trying to tie things together, you have a short amount of time, my videos really play in as that synthesizing, unifying, integrating voice that may be helpful in the terminal parts of your preparation.
So, okay. So for people who have a base and maybe are in the second half of the preparation, more useful for them. And then there's a book also which will go along. And you mentioned in your, like when you were explaining about this, if you use first aid correctly, like you mentioned this as a sentence. What do you mean by if you use first aid correctly?
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple ways to frame that problem. Number one, First Aid, as many of you know, is a great resource, but just has the factoids, but doesn't necessarily have the context behind those factoids. So
Okay.
that's where I work with many students, and they come to me that, hey, I've read through first aid and I've done this for hours and hours and hours and maybe slightly memorized it, but I'm still not able to accelerate on my preparation. And so in my mind, I say, okay, well, we have to use first aid very effectively. We have to use first aid as a resource that allows for you to synthesize all of the questions you're getting wrong into
Mm,
one area so that you
yeah.
have visual spatial recognition of where you're missing it in first aid. Now, in the traditional sense, many people are like, oh, annotate your mistakes into first aid. Now,
Mm,
while I think that there may be some merit to that, I do think that that increases the cognitive load in terms of making your first aid extremely messy that you don't even come back to it because there's just like so many notes here and there, here and there. And, that brings me up to a very important point that just because you create a note in first aid doesn't mean you know that concept very well. And so, in my opinion, it's all about doing a plethora of resources. Let's say it's RX or AMBOSS or UWorld, and understanding, man, that's where in first aid that concept is. And
mm,
so, if you can do that in a consistent manner, just correlate rather than annotate, I think that that's one tip of the iceberg when it comes to utilizing first aid very effectively. Now, there are ways to effectively review UWorld that obviously we can delve into, but I do think that staying very focused on your correlation with first aid will be very helpful.
yeah. So for the review of UWorld, there's the Fab Five, which we know from your YouTube videos. You can tell us a little bit about it. Because I know it's hard to explain it without the whole slides, but I think I'll link that video right up here right now if you're watching this, because I think that's a great way to review UWorld. I actually like you told me when I was struggling with it personally, I asked you. So like if you can just explain a little bit I know it's difficult without the slides, but what is Fab Five UWorld?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Fab Five technique came from a personal challenge that I had, which was basically I spent hours and hours on UWorld and I wouldn't be able to get through many questions because it took me the whole day to, for example, review a block of incorrects. So then I
Mm,
asked myself, I said, let me go ahead and do the specific incorrects that are deemed high yield or that are deemed objectively wrong. And that is the Fab Five. That is where after a block, you go into the UWorld analysis view and you filter to your incorrects and start using metrics like overall time spent. That is a very good question to review first. For example, a question that percent others got correct very high, but you got it wrong. That's another one. So these are all of the criteria that I use to really figure out in a block of 40, for example, which are the incorrects that I should tackle first based on objective data in the UWorld analysis view.
okay, I think that sums up the strategy. I used I now for step two I use a I don't know, a modified version of Fab Five. I would say like I created my own Fab Five. So I go through all the all the incorrects, not just the five, but I definitely single out like four or five based on that criteria, and I just focus on them a bit more, so as to really nail down those topics. Like maybe 80% of the people got this question right, and I got it wrong. So maybe I would spend a little bit more time on that, like why, how can I get this wrong? It was an easy thing. So
Yeah.
I do it a modified version of it myself, but yeah, the idea came from that.
Yeah, no, but I'm so glad. And I think that that's growth in and of itself because essentially what you're doing is you're combating the linear approach of let me just go numerically, which are the
Yeah.
incorrects. You're being more strategic. And that actually brings up a very good point that your goal when you're coming to USMLE preparation is to have a high accuracy on the highest yield concepts. See,
Yeah.
there's always going to be these esoteric concepts. You don't need to chase those small little details.
Yeah.
You need to
True.
make sure you get 85% hit rate on the highest yield concepts. And so if 80% of students are getting that question right and you're not, that's a question that you want to say, I need to have that consistency around the fundamental.
Yeah, yeah. It's fine to get the question wrong, which only 30% have maybe marked it correctly, but it's absolutely necessary to get the question right, which 80% have marked correctly. So I
Definitely.
think, yeah, that's a strategy. Like I focus more on that as well. So talking about more about step one. So we've discussed a little bit of generally about the preparation phase, but when should we start with the self-assessment? So there are like currently there are NBME 25 to 31. So I think there are seven NBMEs. There's free 120. There's UWorld essay. So like there are 10 to 12 self-assessment exams. So how to structure them? How would you recommend, and what to do when, like when to start the self-assessments, or like, and how to even book the exam, like what score to target. Okay, now I can book the exam and stuff like that. So all about self-assessments. What are your recommendations for it for step one?
Sure, absolutely. So for step one, I think it's absolutely imperative for you to get through all of the assessments 25 to 31, UWorld 1 and 2, old and new free 120. So I think that that is key. It really depends because it's very time limited. You know, if you have to appear for your exam in March, then you begin with the end in mind and just kind of make sure you are taking an NBME or an assessment 1 to 2 times per week. In my opinion, though, once you start getting a little bit over halfway in UWorld, like 65, 70%, I would start doing one of the assessments. You can even start with UWorld Self Assessment 1 and
Mhm.
continue on with your UWorld and then continue every week to take one assessment. Now, there's this whole adage that, oh, I'm wasting assessments. And whether that may or may not be true, you know, it's up for debate. But in my opinion, I don't think that there's so much a sense of wasting assessments because all knowledge is good knowledge, and making sure that you review those questions are great. After a while, if you have a protracted timeline of your NBME and USMLE Step 1 preparation, taking those NBMEs again is actually very favorable. In my opinion, though, taking them online is so important because, yes, offline, it can definitely add up in terms of cost. And that is,
Yeah.
again, a case by case basis, but it allows for you to have that real exam performance mindset. And that also plays a factor into your overall score.
Yeah. I think the analysis is what we're looking for, actually, like the analysis. And now I think it comes in your chances of passing if you take the exam in a week
Yeah.
instead of a score. I know there are a lot of, correlations available on Reddit to get an exact score out of this, like a lot of graphs. Like if I've taken NBME 27 and I've got 70% correct, then this would be the predicted score. We can go into the intricacies, but like what would you say is a safe score to target, that, okay, I can confidently go into the exam because I was getting this much in my NBMEs?
Yeah. So I actually use it based on the online interpretation. And my goal when I prepare with students is
Mhm.
2 assessments separated by a week apart with a greater than 95% chance of passing. And that also should be correlated to about a 70% correct on the old or new free 120. And I think that that is definitely a safe zone. Now, in terms of raw percentage correct, I would shoot for 75% raw percent correct if you are doing it offline. But I do think that the predictive score online, you want to get above 95%.
Yeah. So I'll share an anecdote for my preparation. So I when I was doing these NBMEs, I was taking it like just a month before my exam date. I had taken a baseline when I had done 80% of UWorld and I passed that. So I was like, I can book the exam. I have passed it. And subsequently, the NBMEs finished, and I was getting around 75% correct. Like I was like, good. It had a 99% chance of passing if I would take it in the next week. Then I booked the free 120 at the center 1 week before the step one exam actual, and I bombed it. I
Wow.
got 68% in the free 120. And I was like, how can I, like, that created a very, tough situation. I have passed all my NBMEs, even my base NBME I passed. Like,
Wow.
I did not even have the whole knowledge of UWorld for it. I passed all subsequent NBMEs comfortably, and I bombed my free 120. Uh, I won't say bomb. 68% was okay, but I expected more according to the scores I was getting in my NBMEs. And yeah, I think that was really, it wasn't heartbreaking, but it created a doubt in my mind that should I go for the exam? But eventually I went in and everything worked out.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean, leading into
what would you
practice exams is key.
What would you recommend the last self-assessment? When should it be? Because I took it 1 week before my exam.
Yeah. I think honestly, like the way that I approach it, just to get very granular, is I approach it by doing an assessment like free 120 3 days before my exam. Then
Uh,
another 3 days before that exam, I'll do the old free 120. And then
uh-huh.
about a week out, I'll do my last NBME. And then I like to alternate between the UWorld self assessments and the NBME. So I'll do like an
Yeah.
NBME, UWorld self assessment, NBME. The last 2 weeks of preparation, I recommend doing 2 practice exams a week.
Okay. So because like UWorld, I feel tries to trick you, and NBMEs are like, I'm not tricking you. I'm giving you the answer. Just trust yourself. So I think it's like that.
Yeah, I mean it everybody has, I think, their own interpretation. I think that UWorld self-assessments, the take home point is that you have longer stems. And so
Yeah.
if you have longer stems, that means you have more data points that you have to kind of sift through to figure out whether or not that is correlated to the correct answer. NBME have much shorter stems, but all in all, on exam day, you are going to have 60% more NBME style, 40%
Gonna be a
kind of
mix.
like
Yeah.
UWorld style. Yep,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
It's gonna be a mix. Okay, since you mentioned about the long stems and the short stems, what are some of the strategies like, I don't know, test taking strategies which you swear by? Like, for example, just an example, always read the last sentence of the question first. Something like that. Like something you would always tell your students who work with you, like, this is how you answer a question. So, like, yeah.
Yeah. So in my opinion, I would say that reading the last line of the vignette, which is the stem, whether that's what's the most likely diagnosis, what's the next best step in management, what's the likely mechanism, etc. I think that that is a great strategy. But my number one strategy is to paraphrase after every single period. And what paraphrasing essentially is twofold. Number one, it is thinking like the test maker. Why was this sentence put into the vignette? What does
Mhm.
it aid in my understanding? Or is it something that I can rule out my thought process? And I want to emphasize one big thing. The USMLE, these UWorld questions and NBME, they are never, ever, ever, ever trying to trick you. They are never trying to trick you at all. What they're trying to do is they're trying to assess whether you can take a data point and say that that is not related to the underlying disease. If they
Uh,
say negative troponins, they're not trying to trick you. They're trying to say, we are not
wow.
dealing with acute coronary syndrome. So
Yeah.
that's point number one. And then I think point number two is paraphrasing also means that after every sentence, you're centering yourself around a working mechanism or a working diagnosis, because then that builds momentum throughout the vignette and allows for you to play offense and allows for you to predict an answer before going into the answer options.
Yeah, I think yeah. I actually I saw one of your videos, or was it a class on NBME vignettes? I don't remember. But you mentioned about that like negative pertinence or
Pertinent
something
negatives. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
pertinent negatives, that they, with every sentence they're trying to tell you that, okay, rule this option out, or you can rule this one in. And
Yep.
I follow that. Like, for example, you said there's negative troponins. Like, I'm not even reading the next part of the question. I just rule out MI, for example, negative troponins.
Yeah.
Like, and
Exactly. And
eventually
you want
by
to,
the
yeah, go ahead.
last sentence, I have ruled out two or three, and then I'm left with the other two, three.
Very
Yeah.
nice. Yeah, no, that's exactly how you want to do it. And remember, the best answer is the one that has the most pertinent positives and
Yeah.
pertinent negatives
This is what
correlated.
you said. Yeah, this is what you said in the video. Okay. So this was about the question strategies. We've discussed the self-assessments. We've discussed preparation, resources, your resource about step one. So now let's move on to step two. Let's assume, let's assume you have me as an example. Someone has passed step one, just me, and now preparing for step two, which is me. How would they begin? Because step one has a lot of resources, and for step two, it kind of works differently. And yeah, how does it work differently? Where should a student begin step two prep? And yeah,
Yeah,
let's
so
start.
again, it does depend on the path and where you are in your journey. In general, the big thing that I think about for step two is that it's even more imperative to lean in with questions because there's not really a very comprehensive content review resource. You know, there are boards and beyond, there's online med ed. I have a step two course that kind of synthesizes many of the high yield topics, but leaning into questions early on and the shelf review forms is absolutely imperative. Now, again, it's the similar thought process that if you're getting less than 50% of the questions correct in a mixed step two review question block in UWorld, I would pivot into more focused clerkship and I would get a book or some resource where you're correlating your mistakes after you review your Fab Five. So, in
Yeah.
my opinion, you know, that could be your white coat companion, which I know you really like. That could even be the Amboss articles, whatever the case may be. Having a Yep, exactly. Having a synthesized area where you can correlate your mistakes is great, but it is so key to make sure you get through UWorld multiple times, you get through the CMS forms, and if time permits, or if you're able to layer in using Amboss as focused questions on your weaknesses. If you're struggling with arrhythmias, recognize if you do focused questions, every arrhythmia question has the word palpitations in it.
Yeah. So one thing I personally struggle with is for step one, everyone says like first aid for USMLE step one is like your Bible for your Bhagavad Gita. Like this is the book you should know by the end of it. You should understand what's written and you should know what's written. Like these two things, if you know what's in the first aid, you'll pass the exam. So I didn't do that. I depended on Anki a lot. I started prep in med school. I had like 1,000 days of Anki, so I never really needed to, just go through first aid. Eventually, I had covered first aid in my Anki, but it was all in fragments. I did not have a structure. Like if like I'm sure like if you would ask me, I don't know, a little detail, I would answer. But if you would ask me, okay, tell me everything you know about acute coronary syndrome, I would be like, okay, where should I start? I know the knowledge, but I don't have it, I don't have it synthesized in one place. And for step two, I realized or I decided I don't want to use Anki because it's just too much work. And I was like, I'm gonna do something what like people do it for first aid. So that's why I got the white coat companion. I had a chat with you. How should I correlate everything because I'm new to this. I've always used Anki. So next problem comes in with this approach is okay, I am following the book. I am doing my questions. I am also highlighting or annotating just the very important parts or my incorrects into my book. But then the question comes in, when should I review this book? Or should I even review this book or just carry on hammering more and more and more and more questions? So how should I revise this way? Because with Anki, it's all automated. This card is coming today, fine, it'll come next week. But with this, I have to selectively, open this topic and maybe read about it. So what should
Yeah.
I do? How should I review this?
So I think that it is a very great question. And the summary of what you're probably experiencing is a plethora of notes and not knowing what to do with them. And number two, I think that it is going to underscore the importance of creating vignette-based notes. And
Yeah.
to answer your question, if you can use Amboss to create if you can create, or if you can use, I apologize, Anki to create vignette-based cards that synthesize your NBME mistakes, but also your UWorld mistakes, I think that that is much more superior than annotating in a book. Because when you annotate in a book, yes, you get this kinesthetic learning of this is where it goes, et cetera, et cetera. But the forgetting curve of that is much more. So what I end up leveraging, and I'm not a big Anki fan in general, it just didn't work for me. So I use like very straightforward flashcards like Quizlet, and I just had those without a spaced repetition algorithm. Or I also use Notion. You know, both of them for me are really like linear. I don't have to rely on some weird algorithm. But those linear resources, I make sure I have a structured, intentional vignette-based note. And that vignette-based note at a higher level, I really hone in on defining the problem representation so that it matches your illness script. I'm happy to go through that a little bit more because these are like complex clinical reasoning terms, but this is going into the science of learning. And the science of learning is really all about capturing what the vignette looks like in terms of tempo of the disease, the actual chief complaints, and the demographic features of the patient, and correlating it with your schema of a certain disease. I'll give you a practical example to kind of hone in on that.
Sure.
Let's say that I say the word acute onset unilateral toe pain in a 45-year-old male who is an alcoholic. That is a problem representation, which is basically going to be having tempo, the chief complaint, and the demographic features. But what it did was it activated your illness script, your thought process of gout. So what you want to do is you want to create vignette-based problem representations that have tempo, chief complaint, and demographic features to the point where that in your review of the Quizlet, of the Notion, of the Anki, can activate the illness script over and over and over and over again.
So it's like doing questions again.
Absolutely. But essentially the goal here, and it's a very, unique process and something that I'm very passionate about. It is all about making sure, number one, you make your problem representation specific to the disease. If I say unilateral toe pain that is acute, that can be so many different things, but I captured that vignette and organized every pertinent positive of that vignette to fit tempo, chief complaint, and the demographic features. Once I made that specific, it activated gout. But I'll take you one step further. The goal is to preserve the stem. So you don't need to be a rheumatologist to take this exam. Within gout, there are only 3 or 4 questions that they like to ask. They like to ask, what's the likely diagnosis? They like to ask, what's the risk factor? And they like to ask, what's the next best step in the acute phase? And so the front of the card, after you write your specific problem representation, again, in tempo, chief complaint, and demographic features, you want to put the exact stem that you missed. I missed the next best step in management. And then on the back, you want to copy paste the verbatim answer, because that is what you need to know within gout. That is what I call high yield. And that loops back to what we were talking about. You want an 85% hit rate on the most common things that they're going to test you on.
Yeah. So I also, like, I don't do it in the flashcard sense, but I do the same thing. For example, even like, so I have scanned this book into my iPad, so like I can annotate better and I can get images and all. So I have not underlined or highlighted anything. I have a specific color. I just highlight my incorrect. For example, I missed the next best step. I just highlight the next best step and I write the vignette like you said, or I just underlined the vignette like this was the question and this was the answer. Rest of the flap I should have at the back of your mind, but this was leading to this, and like I missed that. So even when I'm reviewing my notes, uh, I just look at that highlighted part. Okay, this is what I missed. Okay, move on. So like it's a similar thing. It's not a flashcard, but it's a similar thing because I was so fed up of flashcards from my step one that I
Yeah,
was like, can't do this. I did it for too long, like for my own good. And
yeah.
I was completely exhausted of flashcards. I'm like, I'm not using this for step two for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, sometimes the limitation of Anki, like you said, it's just minutia knowledge. You don't have
Yeah,
any context. And just because you have that minutia knowledge doesn't mean that you can answer a vignette based or apply a vignette based scenario. So, I love the way that you're going through it. And it just underscores the importance of having a systematic way to do notes
yeah,
that is time efficient. If you spend 20 hours on reviewing one block in a hyperbolized sense, you're not going to get the net delta at the time point that you want. So
yeah,
it's about being efficient and finding that balance, but staying consistent as well.
yeah. So I think I have found my way for step two, but it might, I don't know, it keeps changing. Let's see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking more about step two. So, as you said, we dive into questions a bit early on than we would for step one. And one of the caveats of this is having a low percentage, getting demotivated, because the percentages I'm getting for UL step two are some of the percentages I had never had for USMLE step one. I've never gone to, I don't know, I don't even want to disclose 40s, 30s, like some blocks, like, and it's very demotivating that I don't know anything. It's also, and I know because of this is because of content gap. Like I just don't know the stuff. That's why I'm getting it wrong, but you still get demotivated. How much you would say use it as a learning resource but like how to combat that? Because for step two, if you're doing questions early, it's a good chance that you will get a less percentage correct on your blocks. So how to stay consistent with it and eventually, increase it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I would tell you that in the initial phases, you shouldn't take a percentage and necessarily correlate it to your self-worth.
Yeah.
I would say that it's all about focusing on the process rather than the outcome. If you focus on STEM, paraphrase, and predict, if you focus on a vignette based note, if you focus in particular, and here's a big hack, the bold words within the explanation and how
Mm-hmm.
they relate to the vignette architecture, I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's key. Now, again, going back to if you do a block and it's, a mixed block is less than 50%, and now you're doing focused, let's say OBGYN questions, and you're still struggling, then I would say lean into a resource like Boards and Beyond or Online MedEd that allows for you to get a overall big picture of the field. In my opinion, you're going to probably have to do the incorrects again, but getting through the actual bank itself, learning from it, focusing on where and what you are missing, and then having the time at the end of the day to synthesize those concepts, I think that's going to be a very great way for you to excel very quickly. It's all about having the growth mindset, though. Every single question you get wrong is an opportunity for you to improve in the next minute.
So like trust the process. Like I am trusting the process. My percentages are improving. It's not where I would want them to be, but it's certainly not where it started from. Like I can
Absolutely.
definitely say that. So like
And that's
I'm
great. I mean,
trusting
that's
the
incremental
process.
growth. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trusting the process. Let's see how far it goes.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
uh,
I mean, I will say another quote that I prepare my students with is consistency is better than intensity. So having
yeah,
3 solid days of studying and then having 7 days off is not as good as having 2 hours of studying each and every day. Consistency beats intensity, and something is better than nothing.
I think I without knowing I am following it. So I think it should be good. So talking more about step two, we've discussed leaning into questions and all, but something which step two has and step one doesn't are what do we call as CMS forms. Uh, where and when, what are CMS forms? Where and when and how you should integrate this excellent resource in your study plan for step two.
Absolutely. So typically for allopathic or osteopathic US graduates, they will be taking these CMS forms with each of their clerkships and their shelf exams. However, if you're in a dedicated phase or you're coming from an IMG route, I would say incorporating the clinical mastery series forms, both offline and online, is going to be paramount. I would recommend doing some online, again, to give you that performance boost, but doing them offline is completely fine. Now, when it comes to the CMS forms, they are shelf or clerkship specific. So you have 4 or 5 forms that are relevant for peds, OB, IM, etc. I would recommend, if you're saying, let's say you're in a focused mode of UWorld, once you cross that 60% mark, that I have finished over 60% of the OBGYN questions, or let's say that you finished one pass of the OBGYN videos and Boards and Beyond or online med ed, I would then lean in and do the clinical mastery series forms. Now, that would be something that I would do as you keep going with your UWorld, but then you want to repeat those in a more dedicated phase where you're doing mixed questions. Let's say you're already in a mixed time test mode state, then what you should do is every day you should what I call snake through the clerkships. So one day is OBGYN form 5, next day is peds form 5, the third day is IM form 5, etc. Then you complete a whole cycle of clerkships, then you move on to all the form 6s. So the more that you can then circulate and incorporate, that will be great. So to combine both of them, maybe let's say there are 4 forms for OBGYN that are the 4 most recent. If you're doing it in a focus mode, you just will take 2 of those forms and do one at the 65% mark and then one at the end of all of your OBGYN questions at the 100% mark, saving the last 2 for when you're going through incorrect pass or mixed pass, whether that's incorrect or resetting. And so in that phase, you want to then snake through all of the clerkships because it's all about being dynamic and it's about going into the content, coming out, going into the content, coming out. Being 5 days in OBGYN means that in the next 3 weeks, you're going to forget a lot of that. So that's why you want to lean in to mix questions and snake through these CMS forms.
So like currently I'm doing mixed questions, and I have no idea how much of each, I know, like each shelf I have completed. Maybe I've completed more of OBGYN and less of peds or something. Like I can look at the U word for that. But I should be doing the CMS forms along with my U word or after a certain, after maybe I hit 70% U word, then I start, or like just along with you.
I would start them early because your goal, there are so many of them, right? I mean, if you think about it,
use them as a learning resource rather than an assessment resource.
I would say it's going to be learning and assessment. I would say it's just a performance resource in the sense that it gives you a different way to sit down, answer questions, different intensity, etc. There are about 4 of the most recent for every single clerkship. So there's psych, neuro, EM family, IM, OB, peds, and surgery. And times 4 forms, times 50 questions each form. I mean, there's no need to save anything. There's no need to save anything. There's so many questions. So if you are planning on taking this 9 years from now, I think that's great. Yeah, save them until assessment. But if you want to really get through these and you want to finish them in a few months, start them early. You can always take them again. I mean, that's the most important part when it comes to step 2 is that imposter syndrome of like, oh, I'm going to wait until life is perfect. You know, the most successful people in this world are able to act in imperfect situations.
Yeah.
You have to start getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's
Yeah.
where, you know, you can really take your score performance and your progress to the next level.
Yeah. I think that hit me hard. Feel attacked, but
It's all about growth.
yeah, it's all about growth. So, jumping from CMS forms to NBME, when should you start taking NBME forms? Should you, and like the baseline and the end, or if you have a specific order in your mind, would you recommend whatever? Anything about NBME exams, order, when to start, when to finish, what score to target, when to book your exam?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think that this is, again, it's a case by case basis, but in
Mhm.
general, what I would recommend is that 7 and 8 are offline. So if
Mhm.
7 and 8 are offline and you're in a dedicated mode, what I like to do is I like to take those and piecemeal them. So if 7 and 8 are there, those are basically 8 blocks, right? 4 blocks per
Mhm.
each exam. So my
Yes.
day cadence would be 2 blocks of UWorld and one of the NBME 7 block 1, block 2, block 3. So I end up over 8 days, I finish NBME 7 and 8 with mixed questions. So that's how I would do the offline forms. Now,
Yeah.
online forms, obviously 9 through 14, I believe there are 9 through
Mhm.
14, I would 100% do. I would incorporate the UWorld self-assessments. Let's say after NBME 11, you do NBME 11, UWorld self-assessment 1, NBME 12, UWorld self-assessment 2, 13, and 14 towards the terminal part. I don't game the system to figure out where 12
Yeah.
harder than 9. This is all about leaning in and assessing yourself more than anything. And then finally, recognize that there are 3 UWorld self-assess, or excuse me, 3 free 120s. There's the old free 120. There's the new free 120, which I believe is 2020 or 2021. And then there's the
And
interactive version, which is currently on the
yeah.
USMLE website. And so utilizing those in the last 10 days of your preparation is gold, because those are very high yield questions that may even show up again on exam day. So I like to save those for the terminal parts of my preparation.
Okay. And when to know that I'm ready to take the exam, and what, I mean, I know the best score to target is as high as you can get it, but generally speaking, what would you say, when to book the exam, before I hit my target score in my self-assessments, or after I've hit my target score in my self-assessment, then I should go ahead and book the exam? Like,
Yeah.
how should this work? Because I'm coming from a pass-fail step one.
Yep.
I have not really gauged myself that when should I book the exam, depending on when am I passing. Uh,
Yeah.
Step
So
two works.
sometimes,
I have
yeah,
to get a target score, like whatever target I
absolutely.
set.
Yeah.
So
And
how
I
to?
would kind of frame, I know that's a really, really great question. I'm so glad you're kind of bringing that up. I would first start with the end in mind. Are there times where you're going to need to go to US clinical rotations? Are you going to need to take it before a certain match day? All of those things are very important to consider, because the last thing you want to do is have a hard rotation and be studying concurrently. So that's point number one. I think point
Yeah.
number two, beginning with the end in mind, solidifying a date allows for you to mobilize all of your preparation to hit that target date. You know, a target date allows for you to kind of all or nothing start preparing for that. There are a
Hmm.
couple phases that I would say. Number one, you need to just first start passing a self assessment. If you can't pass a self assessment, then it's hard to figure out, you know, should I schedule my exam this time, etc. Once you start passing, and let's say you're getting 220 and above, then I would see what the overall cluster is of your assessments. And if you consistently can reproduce that, I would go more for reproducibility rather than validity, in the sense that validity is the true actual goal score. I mean, if you gave me more time, I may have hit my goal score and et cetera. But everything is like a concert and a balance. You know, you're not going to forego this match season, hopefully, to just
Yeah.
like keep hitting at there. Whatever your true intentions and that higher power says is the destiny of your score, you've put your 110% and reached a level where you can actually, you know, continue to go for that. But whatever the case may be, is the case that it is. But in general, recognizing that around 245 or so is like the national average and trying to make sure that that's the second phase. So after passing, try to hit national average, then sky's the limit. And obviously you're going to be time limited by everything as well.
Yeah. Okay. So first is passing it, then is increasing that score, and maybe in between that you book your exam, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this was about step two. Now let's have some, most asked questions. For example, if some person has an attempt in any of the steps, uh, how should they tackle it? How should they, represent it in their CV, in their interview, or what should they do extra to compensate for it? Anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that when you don't pass USMLE step one or step two, obviously there's such an emotional burden with that. And I think that the overall goal, if you feel comfortable, is to be transparent about it. I will tell you, I've worked with many students. I have colleagues who have not passed, family members who have not passed, and they are successful. So even in the moment, it may feel like a door is closing, but in the large context of things, it really is just a moment of growth and a way for you to continue to tackle difficult situations, essentially. And I think that that's the first thing that I want to say when it comes to a failed attempt. Now, a failed attempt, you may want to incorporate it into your personal statement. You may want to incorporate it into a significant challenge as well in ERAS. So those are two areas. In terms of compensating for it, just passing it the next time, I think that that's great. And then holistically, your interview skills, your research experience, your clinical experiences, your recommendation letters, those will all kind of come together and give you a overall, holistic application. So I wouldn't want to go down the route of going crazy with research and stuff like that just because you failed. Do research, because I think that it's important to get some experience onto your CV, but it's not necessarily a compensatory behavior that I'd recommend. The only compensatory behavior that I would recommend is when you do not pass, reflecting why that occurred and having a relatively radical approach focused on questions and focused on assessing yourself at consistent intervals. That is the compensatory behavior that you want to have. You want to have anti-fragility, where if you fail an exam, it fuels your fire to think of something new, get the help that you need so that then you can pass it again.
Yeah, that sounds like good advice. But you use, like you said, you pondered upon the topic of research a bit. How should you, like most med students or most students in general, we are not pioneer researchers, right? We are just dipping our foot into water for research. So how should you start about it, go about it, and to what lengths you should go about it? Any tips in getting a research project, a mentor, a position? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think that that is such a great question. And it is all based on your personal interests more than anything, the overall efforts and resources. And it's a very case by case basis. In my opinion, research is good, like you said, to dip your feet into, and then also articulate the reason why research is so important. That's something that I think as somebody who interviews, I like to see from a student. I don't expect them to even have publications or whatever. Publications are nice, but I just expect a student to, at base level, tell me what do they like about research and why do they think it's so important in the field of medicine. The second thing that I would say is making sure that you have the 3-point shooter mentality. And what that means is that if somebody asks you, how do you become a good 3-point shooter in basketball? The answer is intentional shooting over a period of time. And what that means is that you want to keep throwing yourself out there. If it's networking in your home country, go network. Make sure you're sending mass amount of emails and following up with those emails. Try to see who do you know and go into hospitals and ask them, do you have a volunteer department? Do you have a research department? You're not the first student that has done research. And so leveraging a community and leveraging the digital age and making sure that you're just genuine about research is so important. And again, that is if it aligns with your overall timeline, your current situation, as well as your interest.
Okay. Uh, Also, like about research, is it really necessary to match into competitive specialties like, I don't know, derm? I'm not talking about IMGs or US. In general, anyone who wants to match. Is research more like a compulsory or a necessary thing for competitive specialties?
I think for competitive surgical specialties, definitely dermatology also stands out as a field that
Research
students
heavy.
actually end up taking a dedicated research year. So
Mm-hmm.
again, I think that if that is a field that you want to go into, really setting the infrastructure at an academic institution by networking and trying to get those contacts, I think that that is important. And maybe now, just given the climate, it's important to actually it's essential for your application, especially in the ENT, neurosurgery, and dermatology fields.
Okay. So we talked about steps, we talked about research. Is there any other thing which we can have in our CV to stand out? Like completely random also. I don't know, some co-curricular activities, anything else which we can
Yeah,
improve CV from.
absolutely. So in my opinion, I would say taking an opportunity to look at all of your experiences and figure out what are the most meaningful ones and how can you articulate it effectively in an interview, that's very important. So if your passion is yoga to
Yeah.
senior citizens,
Mm-hmm.
understand and try to articulate as much as you can in a very succinct, deliberate way. Why do you like that specific activity? It's all about showing your passion to the field, your commitment to the field. So I think that that's point number one. And then point number two, I think getting solid letters of recommendation from
Mm-hmm.
notable people who you may have worked with directly, that also makes a big difference. And then, obviously personal statement is another key factor. So it really comes down to showing your passion and consistency to the field.
Okay. So I think we've covered approximately everything. We've covered the steps, we've covered research, we've covered more things about CV. So we've also covered about your teaching career, about High Yield Guru, and you have step one, step two course, you have the book, and you as a teacher. But keeping all those informative and guidance related talk aside, let's end this on a fun note with some rapid fire questions I would love to ask you.
Sure.
Uh,
I'm excited for this one.
from the top of your head, whatever comes, let's do rapid fire and wrap this all up. So yeah, let's begin. What do you like more, step one or step two?
Step two,
Okay. UWorld or Amboss?
UWorld.
Anki or not to Anki?
No Anki.
Note taking or no note taking?
More questions.
Apple or Android?
Apple.
Instagram or X or Twitter?
X.
Doing UWorld twice or doing a second QBank?
UWorld twice.
More difficult for you personally, step one or step two or step three?
Step one.
What would you do if you were not a doctor?
Elementary school teacher.
I believe you are doing a teaching course anyway. So
I'm doing my master's. Yeah, medical
yeah,
education. Yeah. Exactly.
okay.
But I just love kids and I love to teach. So elementary school teacher.
Okay. Sketchy or no sketchy?
No sketchy.
Chai, tea, or coffee?
Chai tea if I have company. coffee is much quicker for me.
Okay. Your dream car,
Porsche Cayenne.
your dream holiday destination with your partner,
Maldives.
your favorite cuisine.
Indian.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good way. Good question.
That's a good
Good
one to end on,
question.
right?
Yeah.
No, I love all foods, honestly, but yeah, Indian food, paneer, I love those kind of things. So, no, that's great.
Yeah. After this episode, I think everyone is going to the kitchen or the Indian restaurant and, ordering some food. So
I
yeah,
wish we could all do it together. That's the
yeah,
most fun, but no, that's great.
yeah. So I think it was an honor talking to you, to getting to learn from you, and hopefully the audience did get some value out of this. Even if they've passed the steps, I'm sure there was some value everyone got out of this podcast, because I certainly did. I was a bit selfish. I asked some personal questions as well, but hey there, if I have the opportunity, why not? So thank you for being with me for this podcast, for taking out the time, and for being so kind in guiding all of us and me personally. And yeah, that's it.
Absolutely. Well, Subhav, I really thank you for the opportunity. And to everybody listening, this is just my absolute passion. So thank you all for being a part of that passion today, and hope to do more episodes in the future.
Yeah, hopefully I go along in my journey and I can ask you more questions about the next steps. And yeah, we can spread a lot of value out of from this.
Absolutely. Happy to be a mentor to you and to anyone interested. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. And again, you can find Dr. Rahul. I link his channel, I link his socials, I link his website, his courses, his books. I link everything you need to know about Dr. Rahul in the description below. And you can find him there and, I don't know, message him, connect with him, and I'm sure he'll help you out in some way or the other.
Absolutely.